welcome back to Streaming Media West 2017. As I mentioned before, we've got several people from Brightcove. And with me today, I've got David Syed, who's the VP of Product Strategy.
That's right. Thanks, Tim.
Tell me about the HEVC AV1 Smackdown that you just came out
the
of.
Smackdown panel. Yeah, so it was the battle of the next generation codecs panel, and it was basically a conversation about HEVC, VP9, AV1, and other wonderful three-letter acronyms that most of the world don't care about, but of course we care about them deeply here. We love all of our codecs at this show.
So, you know, one of the things we consistently do as an industry is underestimate Apple.
Yes.
And we underestimated Apple in the Dash world. Now, you and I, of course, worked on fragmented MP4 conversations long before Dash. And Apple, of course, has now finally come around to FMP4, but on their own terms with HLS, and HLS continues to be really dominant. So having said that, Apple chose to go HEVC.
Yep.
They're not going VP9, they're not waiting for AV1. Does that mean the game's over?
Yeah, I don't think it's ever over. You know, I don't think there is ever a winner. In fact, before the panel, as you know, one of Brightcove's products is Encoder, which is the leading cloud transcoding platform, and I pulled some stats, and we do over 1 billion minutes of transcoding a year.
Wow.
That is, you know, I wanted to Wolfram Alpha because I wanted to get it to tell me what does that actually mean in a meaningful way. And it's over 2,500 years of content.
Wow.
It's a large amount of content, and that comes from all sorts of different sources.
Sure.
It's everyone from UGC, user-generated content type things, to things like we're doing here, to also broadcasters. And when I look at the codecs that are being used as output formats, by and large, as you would expect, is H.264. So I would say about 80% of our output today is H.264. And then we have VP9, we have VP8, we have HEVC. We also have Windows Media. You know, that's still something that's out there. And I think it's one of these things where codecs coexist and they kind of age out over time. But there's usually a couple of codecs that exist with, you know, similar market shares for a period of time. In parallel. Now, it's been very different since the dawn of the iPhone, where the industry has predominantly been H.264.
Well, and I would argue that even before the iPhone, because what Gary did, and Gary Williams, and with ITU and MPEG, and being able to take what I had used in video conferencing, which was H.264, figure out how to get it to tie into the streaming side. You know, ultimately we had a codec that everybody could rely on, and like in the DVD space, we had a common format that everybody could work from. We're past the end of life of AVC, although some would argue, obviously, that we've got things like context-aware encoding, and we'll talk about that in a minute.
Sure.
Because you have this year's worth, can you see historically, month to month, HEVC is growing, VP9 is growing, or did you just look at it as a snapshot?
So I've only really looked at it as a snapshot so far. Anecdotally, since the Apple announcement, there's been a lot more interest in HEVC. Now, we announced support for both HEVC and VP9 at NAB last year, so NAB 2016. And we have people doing some work with VP9, some work with HEVC. It tends to be, interestingly enough, it tends to be quite geo-specific. So in certain areas, certain regions where perhaps people aren't monetizing their content very well, not having to pay any kind of royalty, therefore going the VP9 route is actually very interesting to them. But it tends to be a tiny, tiny percentage of our overall traffic.
And geographically, is it also, I mean, at this point, Android is either going to be VP9 or AVC H.264. Do we have a sense as to whether Google pushing Android toward HEVC, which I doubt will happen because they've got AV1, but whether that would tip the scales, or whether we're going to be back in the situation where all Android is AV1 or VP9, all Apple is HEVC, and suddenly we're in a two codec.
A duopoly.
Yeah, duopoly.
Yeah,
like
I think that's exactly what we'll see.
I
think that's exactly what we'll see.
Right.
And the percentages will be different depending on the region. On an aggregate basis, it's probably going to be a 40-60 split, something like that. But where where the rubber meets the road for us, which is, for our customers who are the content providers, the content deliverers,
Sure.
the streaming services and so on, they are going to be in a world where they need to support both.
Okay.
Because if they want to target the iOS environment, they're going to need, and by the way, what we're really talking about here is for UHD content.
Sure.
Right?
Absolutely.
Because if you're not doing UHD content, then H.264 AVC still has plenty of runway.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because I've been working on getting a survey ready to go out, and some of the companies who want to sell HEVC are arguing, it's just as good for 720p, just as good for 1080p. However, as you and I have talked about, context-aware encoding allows AVC H.264 to continue to have legs. Let's talk a little bit about what context-aware encoding is.
Sure. So context-aware encoding is a technology that we announced, I believe it was around May this year.
Okay.
And essentially, it is our take on the per title
Sure.
Encoding optimization. So rather than trying to apply the same encoding settings for every single piece of content without reference to the actual content itself, we're actually analyzing that content, the what's in that content, but also how it's going to be used, and that's the context piece.
Right.
So over time, that's going to become a lot more intelligent in terms of really being able to take into account the device, how it's actually being used, how it's connected, and so on. And so we're able to make decisions as to the number of steps in the bitrate ladder,
Right.
as well as the bit rates themselves.
So
as well as the
dynamically creating the ladder. And you know what I hear? I don't hear you saying this specifically, but one thing that I'm hearing now throughout the show, as I've talked to multiple people, is the extent to which machine learning is actually coming into play for looking at things like context, looking at things like bitrate ladders, looking at things like metadata and that type of thing. Are we at a point where you may not necessarily need that person who has the skill set of being a master encoder, because the machine learning itself is going to grow and allow the encoding solution to pick contextually what the best model is, or do you think we'll still have a need for sort of the encoder as
the compression expert?
The compression expert.
I think that the idea behind context-aware encoding is that it's the easy button for video encoding, and so the idea is that you are paying us as a Brightcove customer to be the video experts, and you are trusting us to make the right decisions for your content.
So that's part of your value proposition, is that you've got the expertise that then your customer can benefit from.
Right, and it's. I should stress that it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all solution. I mean, there are going to be, maybe it's an 80-20 rule where 20% of customers, need, rightly or wrongly, perceive the need to have very, very fine-grained control over individual codec settings.
And in fact, if I remember correctly, you've even got multiple profiles for your context aware.
We do, but I guess where I'm going with that train of thought is that, for that 20% who really care deeply enough about having control over the n degree encoding settings and setting the B reference frames and all of those fun things that most people don't care about, but at this event a lot of people do. Context-aware encoding is probably not the right technology for them. The idea is that it's abstracting that. It is the expert in a box.
Right.
But if you are an encoding expert and you, for whatever reason, decide that you are going to do a better job than we can, then we will give you that control. But it will be through the traditional way of interacting.
Well, and it's interesting. It may keep the compression expert on their toes in terms of having to learn how to continually be better. If nothing else, it may force them to consider per title encoding as opposed to one size fits all from the other side.
And I think that's kind of an interesting message to our customers, is why there's a lot of interest in HEVC, VP9, AV1, and a lot of the time it's around the higher resolutions, but also there's an argument to be made for bitrate savings and just applying it to SD content. The fact is that things change. So as soon as you change that codec, other things in your delivery chain actually change. Your workflow changes, but your delivery chain as well. So, your player environment may look different. The way you do DRM may look different. And so in some situations, there might very well be a lot to be said for using something like context-aware encoding with H.264, realizing similar bitrate savings, with up to 1080p content, because that might be the majority of what you're actually delivering. Now, if you are in that UHD world, and by UHD I specifically mean 4K, HDR, high frame rate, and so on, where where you have a 10-bit a color space, and you need HEVC, VP9, or AV1, of course that's a very different conversation.
It is. And in there you're going to be learning along with everybody else, where essentially what you're saying is, on the other side, if you got a workflow that works and you can eke more benefit out of H.264, potentially stay with that for a while until the rest of the stuff sorts out.
Yeah, I mean, look, at the end of the day, making money out of media is hard.
Right.
It's a difficult business. If you're an ad-supported business and you're primarily doing VOD content, it can be really tough.
Sure.
And so reducing your delivery costs is a fantastic way of making those economics look a lot better.
So on the final question, seg off of VOD into live, you all have announced a new publishing platform, is that correct?
For live,
For
yes.
live, okay.
Yes, exactly. So we introduced Brightcove Live, GA'd it at NAB.
All right.
And we've been doing live for several years, and we've been learning with the rest of the industry.
Sure.
The majority of the type of live work that we've been doing has been event-based live.
Right.
I would say over the last 18 months or so, we've really seen a growing interest in being able to do live linear. So 24/7 simulcasting, and not just taking existing live channels and moving them online, but also creating virtual channels, virtual live channels.
Repackaging multiple live things to tie
exactly,
together. Okay.
And in some cases that's really nothing more than a VOD playlist, but maybe interspersed with some actual live content, right? So it's a little different.
Well, and it gives the chance for content publishers and content owners to try out new channel ideas and see where they get traction on those, and ultimately that may drive back to adding that back into the cable space, because that model would say we can test out and see whether we've got traction here, and then move up the chain.
Yeah, and one of the things we've heard is over long vacations, right, having specific interest channels for kids of different ages.
Sure.
Right. I mean, the economics of doing that in a traditional broadcast environment, they just don't make sense. The economics of doing it in an environment where you need to provision a hardware encoder don't make sense either.
In fact, I was visiting some friends just before I flew out here, and this is pre-Halloween. Hallmark has already switched over one of their channels to just holiday movies. And I'm thinking, from a practical standpoint, that would be an ideal OTT play, as opposed to having, because essentially what they're doing is taking a channel that everybody's used to doing one thing throughout the year, and then switching it over for 3 months, and then switching it back.
Yeah, and it will be interesting to see how many viewers they lose as a result of doing that, because it's
or gain and then lose in January when they go back to the regular schmaltzy Hallmark things that aren't quite holiday focused.
Brightcove Live is focused on both 24/7 and event-based live, and what we've really tried to do is to really reduce the price point to make it a very, very cost-effective way of doing live.
And are there trial accounts that people can sign up for?
Yes, they have to. They should contact their Brightcove account manager, or just submit an inquiry on our website, and we'd be pleased to help them.
Fantastic. David, as always,
Tim, thank you very much.